right, good morning, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to the July 3rd Thursday Web Forum. As always, I'm Hilary Morris. I work on user support and communications for the South Atlantic Blueprint. And we host this web forum every third Thursday of the month here at 10 a.m. And it's intended to give folks like you a chance to ask questions and provide feedback to help inform the conservation future of the South Atlantic region. So here's our usual agenda. I'll start by introducing our speaker. We'll hear 30 to 40 minutes on the monthly topic. There'll be plenty of time for Q&A and discussion. I'll preview next month's webinar, give some updates from staff, and then we'll pause again for more questions and discussion. Usually I put us all in silent mode, but I feel like everyone's being really mindful of their own mute button, so I'm just going to leave well enough alone today. Just please be sure to keep your line muted so we don't get background noise. So if you have questions or comments or want to speak up during the presentation, just feel free to jump in. Rua and I are giving the talk today, and we're always happy to have it be super informal, or you can use the chat box, and I'll try to keep an eye on that during the presentation. So, like I said, Rua and I are going to be tag teaming this talk today. I already introduced myself. You probably know Rua already as the science coordinator for the South Atlantic Blueprint. And today we're going to be taking an in-depth look at how you can use the South Atlantic and the Southeast conservation blueprints to inform your organization's priorities. So really quickly, in case we have new folks joining us on the line today, what is the blueprint? It's a living spatial plan, a map that prioritizes opportunities for shared conservation action in the face of future change. And it's intended to help guide and facilitate conservation actions that sustain both natural and cultural resources. I am starting to hear some background noise, y'all, so if someone did join, would they mind putting themselves on mute? Otherwise, I'll put us in silent mode. Okay, I think I'm going to go for silent mode. Hang on.
The conference is now in silent mode.
All right, sorry, y'all. That means that if you want to speak up during the presentation, you'll have to hit *6 to unmute your line. So the blueprint is intended to guide and facilitate conservation actions that sustain both natural and cultural resources. And I always want to highlight that this is more than a map of land acquisition that we're looking at here. It's also identifying places where you might want to take other types of conservation action, like management, like economic incentives. So this isn't one map to rule them all, as we like to say. We're not saying drop what you're doing, use the blueprint instead. This is totally complementary. It's just a regional lens that you can use in combination with your local data and local knowledge. But of course, lots of you who may want to use the blueprint may work beyond the boundaries of the South Atlantic geography. Maybe you work at the scale of a whole state, for example, and you need a blueprint that covers your entire area. So that's where this effort called the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy comes in. So through this CCAS blueprint or Southeast blueprint, all of the spatial priorities that were developed through all the LCCs working in the Southeast have been stitched together into a cohesive whole. So in the South Atlantic region on this map, it's the same as the South Atlantic blueprint priorities. It's just integrated with those neighboring blueprints like pieces of a puzzle. And at both scales, this blueprint, the Southeast and the South Atlantic, they're both being implemented to help inform decisions and support proposals. So if you've tuned into any past presentations on the blueprint implementation strategy, this flowchart might be familiar to you. It's really just kind of our logic model, our theory of change for how using the blueprint can improve ecosystem integrity on the ground, primarily by bringing in new resources to implement conservation or by helping you use your existing resources more efficiently and strategically. So today we're going to be focusing on this bottom box of the flowchart. Today's webinar is a sequel kind of to the April 3rd Thursday web forum where Rua and I were focusing on the box at the top, how the blueprint makes proposals more competitive. So I just kind of wanted to set the tone for today and say that if you did tune into that April webinar, things are going to have a slightly different feel because our goal with that webinar was really to walk you through the exact steps that staff usually follow when we're helping to strengthen a grant. So we were showing you in detail, here's how you can analyze the indicators and the threats and the blueprint priorities, with the thought that you could replicate that approach if you wanted to tackle that on your own. And so now obviously part of the user support that we do as staff is still to help you with your proposals, and we're still more than happy to do that. But compared to what we're going to talk about today, all that proposal stuff is a little quicker. It's a little more straightforward. Typically, when an organization wants to use the blueprint and whatever suite of complementary landscape scale information they'd like to use to help them set priorities, that's more of a longer-term collaboration, where Rua and Louise and Amy and Mallory and I are working closely with you and your team and your partners to understand what are your goals, what are you trying to accomplish, and then together we'll, as a team, sort out the best ways to identify what your piece of the blueprint might look like and what other data sets we might want to bring in. So my goal today isn't so much that you walk away from this webinar with a recipe for how to use the blueprint to set your organization's priorities. If that is what you take away from this, more power to you, that's awesome. But definitely think of today as a little bit more conceptual. It's a little bit more geared toward giving you ideas about the sorts of approaches we can use to filter down the blueprint. So it'll be a little less specific about technical analysis steps. And once again, I want to emphasize that staff are here to help you and your organization find your piece of the blueprint. That's a huge focus of our work, and we will work with you to help inform your priorities if that's what you want to do. So, before I jump into our case studies that are going to take up the bulk of our presentation today, I did want to mention again that staff are working on an online guide to using the blueprint, and you can think of this as sort of a compilation of different examples to inspire you, to potentially give you some new ideas about how to connect to this larger strategy. We've been supporting Blueprint users now for the last several years, and we've learned an enormous amount about the types of approaches, the types of wording and maps that are most helpful in different situations. So we're going to break this Blueprint user guide into a few main themes of the types of ways that people have used the Blueprint. And then in that guide, we're going to get into some really specific case studies. So one way that folks are using the Blueprint is to strengthen their funding proposals. That's what we went over in April. They're also using it to prioritize the best places to work, both as individuals and for organizations. That's the focus of our webinar today. Folks are using the Blueprint to communicate the importance of their area in the larger landscape, sort of set that landscape scale context. It's going to go over how folks have used the Blueprint to report on metrics of conservation impact. What are the outcomes that result from taking a particular conservation action? And then also demonstrating that the conservation community can speak with one voice. We've seen this kind of recently in creating new funding sources or defending existing ones when you need to show that, yes, we are working together as part of a shared vision, and this is a rigorous and science-based prioritization that we're using to allocate those funds. So keep an eye out for this in the coming months. We've been so busy with actually supporting Blueprint users that I haven't made as much progress on this as I'd like, but it is a really good problem to have because all the stuff that we're working on is going to make great examples in this guide. So stay tuned for that. All right, now for the good stuff. How have different organizations been using the Blueprint to set their priorities? One recent example is through the South Carolina chapter of the Nature Conservancy. They were looking to update the conservation vision that they use for South Carolina statewide. It's basically their map of conservation priorities, and it hadn't been updated since 1998, so it was due for a refresh. And the timing was really critical because it positioned them to use this new vision to support the reauthorization of the South Carolina Conservation Bank. That's a major funding source from the South Carolina State Legislature. So they were looking to combat a perception among the legislature that the conservation community can't agree on one set of priorities, that there's no strategy for how that funding is spent. So they felt that the Blueprint was poised to help them address those concerns. And in addition, of course, a lot has changed since 1998 in terms of the geospatial technology that is available, our ability to model threats and corridors, et cetera. And they wanted to take advantage of that in this update. So they wanted their final map of the vision to include core areas, buffers, and corridors. So this is what their old vision looked like. You can see that cores, buffers, corridors approach. That's something that they'd use that they wanted to maintain going forward. So this is kind of where we started. And then here's the updated vision that we sent them. It's not been formally approved yet by the Nature Conservancy, but essentially what we did here was filter down the Blueprint to identify the portions of the Blueprint that fit their characterization of cores, buffers, and corridors, that fit what that meant to them. And because this was so important as a communications tool, kind of that rallying point for multiple organizations in the conservation community to come together and agree on these key priorities, they really wanted kind of a high-level display of focal areas. And they wanted to remove some of the priority speckles that you see in the Blueprint. So we basically used some kind of grouping techniques in ArcGIS to pare down the map just to the larger chunks of priority area. So all of the pixels that you see colored in green or gray on this map are also part of the blueprint. We've just kind of organized those pixels differently, and we've left some pixels out that weren't part of these big clumps. So basically, the cores in dark green are contiguous patches of highest and high priority, really big patches. And then the buffers and the restoration areas bring in even larger contiguous areas of medium priority. So the corridors themselves come from the connectivity analysis in Blueprint 2.2. And then because the Nature Conservancy understandably wants to incorporate their resilient lands analysis, that's Dr. Mark Anderson's work on identifying places that are important for biodiversity in a changing climate, they wanted to bring that analysis in. And so we added in the pink here, the large contiguous patches of above average resilient areas that weren't already captured in the blueprint. That resilience analysis is part of the blueprint, so that's informing a lot of the green already, but there are some that don't get captured in the blueprint, and so we've highlighted those separately in pink. So that's what we put together for the Nature Conservancy for their new conservation vision. So that's one of our more recent examples of how an organization has used the blueprint to set their priorities. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Rua now to talk about another case study in Florida. Just remember to hit *6, Rua.
I've already done it.
Beautiful.
I'm ahead of the game. Okay, excellent. All right, so give me 1 second to share screen. Okay. So back to where we were here. So the next example here is in the Big Bend of Florida, the Big Bend Landscape Conservation Design. And so in this case, you had one organization, Fish and Wildlife Service, is now looking to these things they call landscape conservation designs to ensure its efforts are part of this larger collaborative conservation strategy. So in particular, this is now an embedded requirement in a lot of policy documents, especially for national wildlife refuges. As part of a bigger national-wide sort of visioning strategy. And it's an evolution that a lot of organizations kind of go through and want to have anyways. This idea of, okay, if we're expanding or whatever that organization's piece, you want to make sure it's aligned with what other organizations have done. In this case, the Fish and Wildlife Service went that next level down and made it a requirement in a lot of its policies for expansion and other components. So given the urgent need to meet this requirement, especially in the Big Bend of Florida, we got some requests from both local and regional fish and wildlife staff to help use the blueprint to meet those requirements for a landscape conservation design. Particularly when you look at the different requirements, it was like, oh, okay, well, looks like we got this covered. What we need to do is kind of tighten it up, customize it, and reframe some of the wording to crosswalk to the policy itself. So in this case, it's an example less of what Hilary showed of sort of filtering down the blueprint, but more of aligning all the different parts of the blueprint and showing how it meets the policy components. So in this case, blueprint information, we use basically everything. All the stuff at some level or others ended up getting used in this kind of crosswalking from all the people and organizations involved, the goals and objectives, indicators, state of the South Atlantic, spatial priorities, and the blueprint implementation strategy. So this is kind of a nice example of pulling all the different stuff available to meet those different policy conditions. So what I'm going to do here is I'll just give you a quick tour of the document and point out some of the places and the way the blueprint information was used and how we helped with that crosswalk. So I'll pull it up. This is available. I'll show you the link in a second. So this ended up being in the form of more of a report kind of component here, and this is available on the website. I'll show you where it is to go see it. But basically the classics kind of executive summary, intro, discussion of the boundaries, and then crosswalking to their policy, they have these sort of components of requirements related to people, purpose, process, and the product itself. And essentially what we did is marshal all these different resources and components and then kind of crosswalk and show how they met all these pieces. But the South Atlantic was a little bit too big, and they wanted more sub-regions. So we went down to a lot of the resources that are more localized in some of the different sub-regions of the South Atlantic. So here, classic executive summary, what's so special about this general region. I'll give you a quick visual. This is about the boundaries. So this is the boundary. The maps look a little different than the ones we usually do. This was collaborating with Tom Hochter, University of Florida, was also helping out with some of the mapping and discussions of data sets, which is great. Always glad to work with other folks on this piece. So this is the area, and in this case, they actually wanted to be a little bit outside of the South Atlantic. So some of these sections around Gainesville and on the coast go beyond the South Atlantic boundaries and go into the Peninsula Florida blueprint, which, again, as Hilary said, that's fine. Draw the lines wherever you want. We'll rely on the larger integrated blueprint and resources to help you out regardless of where you draw the line, what state you're in, all that other stuff. So this was a nice case where we had to marshal a little about stuff from Peninsula Florida and Florida into it as well. And so really then what we did on a lot of this is crosswalked. There was a section about, diversity of people involved. And so we basically pulled some numbers that are more general about different organizations, but also some specific stuff related to, in this case, the Fish and Wildlife Service. Well, how many Fish and Wildlife Service personnel have been involved? In this case, it was 121, a lot. And so we basically took the general things and then customized it. The information about the workshops we've done, we talked about, well, what has happened in this specific subregion. So this is the sort of Gulf Coastal Plain subregion. So there were, 3 different workshops in 2015, 2017 in Tallahassee. So this is, again, customizing the general information just for the subregion to go a little bit deeper. Then we have some information about Peninsula Florida Blueprint and the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy. And then purpose, again, just kind of helping with alignment of this is what you're asking for as a purpose, and here's how it meets your purpose. And then on the process front, we really just crosswalked a lot of the goals and objectives and pieces that have already been set and embraced by the community, and crosswalk that information that we already have in various other documents. Sometimes they're links like to the indicators, state of the South Atlantic. Sometimes they're just pulling out specific language. So this is a good example of how, if there's an organizational use and it has meeting a specific policy component, we can help out with some of the crosswalking of these organization-specific things and then draw the line. So if you've already met them through this process and the blueprint, we can help do the language translation and help build those pieces out. So that's what a lot of these pieces are. There are some things about evaluating the drivers and threats of change. So, the classic sea level rise maps and urban growth maps. Classic, normally we're doing things, some basic maps related to threats and more specific indicators. So in this case, we dove a little bit more specific into some indicators that were most relevant to that particular organization. The Fish and Wildlife Service are really interested in some of the species indicators. So we did some threats assessments looking at the indicators and the threats. So in this case, this graph is looking at urban growth, which is that darker gray, and then blue is sea level rise. And it's the percent overlap of these really high indicator value sites and the different threats. So pine and prairie birds in particular in this subregion, a lot of overlap with really high value pine and prairie bird and pine and prairie amphibian areas and future urban growth, but less on the sea level rise front. So we sliced up a couple of specific indicators within there and how the threats might impact them. Every organization has different components that might speak best to them, and so we could do that kind of thing for others. And then we compared that subregion to the larger South Atlantic as well. So this darker gray is just the Big Bend, this lighter gray is the full South Atlantic, and you can say urbanization compared to the rest of the South Atlantic, you have even more threats to pine and prairie birds and pine and prairie amphibians and forested wetland amphibians from urban growth. But then the next one down here is now sea level rise, and the dark blue is Big Bend, light blue is full South Atlantic. It's the reverse. So there's a lot less of a threat of the high value site for some of these things in the Big Bend than there is for the full South Atlantic. They still exist, but it puts a little bit of a context of, well, how does this smaller region fit into the larger picture, which is another thing they were particularly interested in. And then the last piece Well, of course, there's the actual mapping of some various indicators and measures, skipping through things fast just so you can see them. And then this final landscape conservation design, which is basically the Southeast blueprint from Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy. So that is that sort of the spatial depiction of the design is right here, just shown in that subregion. And then the last, actually I got two quick pieces. One, a lot of you know we talk a lot about the known issues of the blueprint and trying to bring those forward and carry them as much as possible. We did, so we have this section here on known issues with this integrated design. We had some people more locally take a closer look at it in the process too. And so in this section, we've added a few major issues that came up from either the local review that came up around some of the maps, but also we pulled some components from the known issues that were specific to this region, like the blueprint undervaluing some areas that were historic habitat for migratory fish. So we tried to pull in a few specific pieces from the larger blueprint known issues and the additional review here. And then we also have a whole component that pulls on the blueprint implementation strategy. So if you remember that, if you were at some of the workshops, you remember we talked about what does success look like in these subregions, what does failure look like, and there was that crosswalk of all these different plans and conservation actions. So we were able to pull that from the blueprint implementation strategy and crosswalk it to meet this requirement for a coordinated adaptation strategy. So all this stuff about success, what failure looks like in the region, what's the role of the blueprint, this should look familiar, what Hilary was just showing you, that sort of theory of change, and also a lot of these different synthesized actions from things like even the Florida Coastal Rivers Basin Surface Water Improvement Management Plan, the SWIM plan, the Florida State Wildlife Action Plans, Georgia too. So the number of kind of key plans with actions that were in that subregion. So really we're distilling and synthesizing some of that stuff and then crosswalking it into the language that would fit with the policy requirements of the particular organization. So that is a very quick tour of the Big Bend landscape conservation design piece. And I will show here, for those, if you want to see the full document, if you go over to the sort of blueprint user section that has a bunch of examples of blueprint users, it's the top one here, and there's a link to if you want to check out the full document for getting some ideas. In fact, I will just show you, since we're on here and you can see things, I'll show you the full path to get here. We'll have this PowerPoint up, but here we are on the South Atlantic. We get a conservation blueprint, and then we go to see who's using the blueprint up on this top right. This is where we keep a lot of these stories if you're interested in sort of ideas of who's using the blueprint and how. And so it is right up at the top here. For more information, see the full document. So you can dive in a little deeper if you are interested. And with that, I will hand it back over to you, Hilary.
Great, thanks, Rua. I'm going to reclaim the presenter power here.
I already passed it. Boom.
All right, so let me get my screen sharing again. Let's see, where did we leave off? Scrolly. Awesome. Well, I didn't just want to leave it with these case studies because we have so much other great stuff in progress right now. So I'm going to wrap up just by giving you kind of a whirlwind of some of our more in-process examples. And we're also going to summarize some of the latest numbers on blueprint use so you can see kind of where we are with blueprint users. So first off, we've been helping a partnership called the Waccamaw Task Force in South Carolina identify their priority areas. So they're using the blueprint and a lot of these other complementary data sets that you see pictured here and listed here to identify priorities for their work in the Waccamaw and the Little PD watersheds. And ultimately, they're going to identify priorities at two levels. One that's really broad and not at the parcel level, so it's more shareable without running into confidentiality issues with private landowners. And then a second level that is getting to the parcel level, which will really inform the scale at which conservation decisions are taking place in this partnership. And that would only be shared with people who kind of have permission to view that information. Another thing that we're working on is helping the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission craft a land acquisition strategy. We actually just had a meeting about that earlier this week. That strategy is likely going to build on the blueprint and other regional, state, and local data sets. So we still have a lot of details to work out on this. It's still kind of early in the process. But some of the things that are being considered are factoring in both observations and suitable habitat for game and non-game species, for looking at aquatic resources, biodiversity, proximity to other WRC-owned and other protected lands, which helps create large protected patches and reduce stewardship costs, and even the available access in that area for people who live there to get to hunting opportunities and connect with open space in general. So this is an example of one of the things that we were initially looking at from the perspective of proximity to existing protected lands. Where are some areas in this this focal area around Mountain Bogs National Wildlife Refuge where the WRC might be interested in building on and buffering some existing protected lands. One that I'm really, really excited about, because a priority for us lately has been engaging with local governments at the town and county level. We've been working with the Catawba Council of Government and with South Carolina DNR to review the natural resource priorities and the new comprehensive plan for Fort Mill, South Carolina. And specifically, we were analyzing how well the habitat cores that they'd already identified, largely based on natural heritage element occurrences, overlapped with the blueprint and some key indicators. So I want to walk through some of the analysis that we put together for them, because I think it'll be a good example. They do plan to actually make some changes based on what we found and formally incorporate this information into the comprehensive plan, which is super exciting. So this was just looking at kind of the most basic level, their habitat cores and the degree of overlap with the blueprint. And then we sort of dove into what's driving those blueprint priorities that the town of Fort Mill might be interested in. They have some really important areas for riparian buffers and kind of good, healthy riparian habitat. This was kind of a custom analysis that we built for them, clipping the indicators down to the blueprint. So we're only showing the indicator scores that occur within blueprint priorities, so that we were being really consistent with these areas that were lighting up for them, because our message was sort of, here are some areas that you might want to consider expanding or adjusting your habitat cores. And so we didn't want to kind of confuse or muddy that issue by showing indicators that occurred outside the blueprint. So what we've done here is clip the indicator down to the blueprint priorities, and we've summarized it in a binary way. So riparian buffers is a continuous indicator, but for this case, we wanted really clear, simple communications tools. So we've kind of done some interpretation for them to show, hey, in dark blue are these places that are in really exceptional condition because they're 95 to 100% natural habitat surrounding rivers and streams. So this is kind of an example of that kind of custom filtered analysis that we can do as staff to help you identify your priorities. Another great aquatic resource was network complexity. So this was showing the number of stream size classes that are connected in a river network, which is really important for climate resilience to give species access to different niches within the stream. There were also some really great above average resilient biodiversity hotspots that weren't already being captured by the cores that we wanted to highlight. And then upland hardwood birds. There was some really great upland hardwood bird habitat that wasn't being picked up that we recommended that they try to pick those up. Fourth example, we're working with the Southeast Regional Partnership for Planning and Sustainability, or SURPASS, to develop this good map that they've been talking about for years. Basically, this is a map of the good places to work. And initially, we were just going to tackle prescribed fire. That was kind of our initial charge. But that's really been expanded to capture the overlap between all the various conservation and military and working lands priorities of all the SURPASS partners. And then the last one I'll mention, because we never want to leave the marine out, we do continue to work with the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council to help them use the blueprint to inform their management priorities and their conservation priorities. So overall, our goal there, working with that group, is to better link what's happening with the fish offshore to conservation actions that are happening onshore. with our eventual goal being, fisheries managers are sort of limited with the tools that are in their toolbox and in their authorities to really limit catch and bag limits and all of that. But what if we could say that reducing non-point source pollution would have X% impact on fish populations? Well, you could start to really broaden your tool set by looking at those land and water linkages. And there's so much more going on than I have time to get into here. So here are the latest numbers on who's using the blueprint. All of these are numbers so far. More than 100 people from 50 different organizations have used or are in the process of using the blueprint. The blueprint has been used in 47 completed projects with 43 more in progress that we're currently juggling as staff right now. So that's a total of 90 completed uses that we know of. And then, or 90 uses total that we know of. And then lastly, the blueprint has informed at least $20.1 million of conservation investment, and 99% of that directly supported on-the-ground action. So these are just some of the metrics that we track to see who's using the blueprint and how it's being useful to them. So with that, I will pause for questions for me and Rua. I'm going to go ahead and take us out of silent mode so that it's easier for us to all have a conversation.
The conference is now in talk mode.
So at this point, you can now manage your mute just with your own phone. So does anyone have any questions or comments?
Hey, this is Cherie Keller.
Hi, Cherie.
My question is, how did these organizations get involved with this? Like, do you have you reached out to them, or have they been finding you and asking you to help? And how did they find out that?
That was a little bit hard to hear, but I think the question was, how are these organizations? That was a little bit hard to hear, but I think the question was, how are these organizations getting involved, and are they reaching out, or are we reaching out?
Yeah, sorry, I'm on a cell phone.
Oh, that's
so
okay. I just wanted to make sure I heard you.
Connection.
I think it's really a mix. So for some of the examples that we talked about, we've had a really strong working relationship with the Nature Conservancy in South Carolina for a long time. A lot of these folks are people who've come to blueprint workshops and have sort of been exposed to this before and have kind of been waiting for that really ideal opportunity to present itself to start to plug in and use this data. Sometimes people do just come to us and reach out, but for example, that story I shared about Fort Mill, that was someone that we've worked with, a regular blueprint user with South Carolina DNR that had been asked to review that comprehensive plan. And she thought, hey, you know what, we should look at how the South Atlantic and the Southeast blueprints overlap with that. So that was one where a blueprint user sort of made that connection and brought someone else in. Did you want to add anything to that, Rua?
No, I think that captures it. It's, part of it's you've got existing relationships, and then when the time is right. But a lot of them have been kind of people coming to ask for a little help, or sometimes we've just been folks sitting down in a meeting together, and you have that conversation. And they say, hey, I wonder if the Blue Group could help with us. Like, oh yeah, let's figure it out.
We have taken some, proactive approaches, like at our workshops, asking people to, please let us know if they need help. So I think we just sort of try to make sure that everyone hears that our door is open, and people kind of walk through it when they're ready.
Yep.
This is Linda Reimer. I have a question, speaking of your door being open, and maybe things can come from just when you're just sort of sitting around and talking. And I think, Rua, I mentioned this on our call this week, Surpass, our coastal resilience group under Surpass, is exploring this whole concept of Sentinel Seascape. Because I don't know if everybody on the call is familiar with the Sentinel landscape, but in terms of, would it be worth a conversation sometime for you and Hilary and our group to sit down and just sort of talk about what would this concept mean, and how could the blueprint possibly be used, and would that be an interesting kind of conversation to initiate?
Yeah, I think that would be, to me, and it's really in line with the larger Surpass charge that I guess came from Gordon and the larger group of trying to figure out how to make the sort of good map work for each of the priority areas, including the sort of the coastal and coastal resilience and the fire. And so I think, that'd be great to start diving on that and figuring out how the blueprint and this larger good map effort could help with those Sentinel seas. I mean, it seems like a great niche, especially given that need for sort of cross-boundary prioritization in the ocean, which is even more sparse than on land.
Right. Okay, well...
Glad to help on that one.
All right, I'll be reaching out.
Yeah, sounds good.
Awesome. Thanks, Linda. That's exciting. Anyone else?
Hey, Hilary, it's Pam Wingrove.
Hey, Pam.
Hey. I don't know if you'll have an answer to this. I'm just going to throw this out maybe for you to think about, and then I can try to catch up with you at a different time. But I'm starting to develop or really investigate the potential for doing some workshops to assist our refuges in developing habitat management plans. And I'm wondering about the applicability of the blueprint for habitat management planning. Do you have any initial thoughts or impression about something like that? I don't know how much you guys are familiar with habitat management plans, but I thought I'd maybe throw that out there for something to think about.
Yeah, I think it's definitely worth exploring. I've got a few ideas on things that might work. I know on the broader comprehensive plan, the CCP, Rob Campoloni up at the headquarters office of Fish and Wildlife Service is really interested in figuring out how the design and the blueprint and stuff could get incorporated in that. But yeah, I think it's definitely worth exploring. I think there's some nice roles, especially with that intent of sort of crosswalking everything to the larger design, from the habitat management plan all the way up. I think that seems like a very, very doable thing to dive a little deeper in and see where it might add some value.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I'd love to explore that.
Yeah.
It's probably a good example where it would be a little bit more like high-level context setting, probably no real replacement for kind of good ground truth information on the types of habitats and the kind of legacy of management strategies and the particular mission that a refuge was established for. But I think there's definitely common ground where we could plug some of that in as that complementary piece. Yeah.
That's what I was thinking too, the sort of that broader context of, okay, given that, that refuge has a sort of mission and components, but when you're looking at multiple competing resources, okay, how does that resource connect with the larger area and what's its relative importance compared to the rest of the section? You got a lot of big opportunities for, Bachman sparrow or fire where there isn't, or, it's some of the similar things about, okay, this is why this place is special, and if you have to choose between this and this, this particular role and managing for this could be more important or less important for this particular refuge.
Right, because it has that significance at the regional scale. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah, follow up with this, Pam. We'll chat.
Okay. Thanks.
Anybody else? I love the discussion. I love that all the discussion is about, I want to use the blueprint. That makes me really happy.
Yeah. I'll take it.
Who else? Plenty of time. All right, I counted to 15. So I'm going to move on to a quick preview of next month's web forum and give some staff updates, but we'll have time again for questions at the end if anything occurs to you in the meantime. So next month, Rua is going to be back. It's going to be August 16th, same time, same connection information today that we use today. He's going to be presenting on the latest on fall products from the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, which I am fondly calling Goals and Threats and Other Data, oh my. Those updates and new resources for CCAS include progress toward an integrated ecosystem report card. So using some existing ecosystem assessments to hone in on what is the condition of the ecosystems of the South and how might we change that and improve that in the future. We're also going to be incorporating an update to the Texas part of the blueprint using new information from the Texas chat, the crucial habitat assessment tool. And so with that update, the blueprint is going to get seamless coverage over most of the United States. So we keep moving closer and closer to that eventual goal of a blueprint for the nation. We're planning to do integrated threat layers covering the whole Southeast and having an integrated hubs and corridors layer that should at least cover peninsular Florida, South Atlantic, North Atlantic, and the Appalachians, and possibly the Gulf Coastal Plains and Ozarks region of the Southeast as well. So for more details, you will have to tune in next month to hear Rua's talk. So let's move on to staff updates. This first one really connects to Rua's August web forum, so he'll get into that in more detail then. But I wanted to let everybody know that a process is underway through the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy to develop an overarching goal for the Southeast, to define, what is the conservation outcome that we're collaboratively working toward. And this is really exciting because our future user support efforts, I think, can connect to that goal by showing how a particular proposal or how an organization's work could contribute to achieving the goal. And so all of the stuff I mentioned that Rua is going to talk about next month about the ecosystem report card, that's kind of a really important context-setting step for understanding, well, where are we now? Where do we think we could realistically get for goal setting? So just to mention this process is underway. And I think it's going to have some important relationships with user support. And then I wanted to just highlight that the review window for the new Greenways and Trails indicator did close last month. We got some great feedback, and in response to that feedback, we're going to do 2 quick updates to the underlying OpenStreetMap data that we use to depict the Greenways and Trails themselves. So one of those updates is in Western North Carolina, and the other is in Florida. So our goal is to have the final indicator up on the CPA by early next month so that it will go out in the newsletter. The overall methodology is going to stay the same. It's capturing both kind of the natural greenway condition and the connected length of a greenway network. So you can go ahead and use the draft indicator that's up on the CPA in the meantime. That'll be available for you until we put the final one up. So unless you're using that data in Western North Carolina or Florida, that draft indicator looks exactly like the final one will. So that's still a resource for you. And then lastly, I always end on this slide. Here's how to get more involved in the blueprint. You can join the South Atlantic LCC website. That'll get you signed up for our monthly newsletter and a monthly reminder email about this web forum. You can always connect with your blueprint staff, me, Rua, Louise, Amy, Mallory, or other members of the cooperative. And then I always encourage you to explore the Conservation Blueprint online. Keep thinking about ways that we can connect this to your work and keep making it better. Does anyone have any other questions or comments? All right, that sounds like a no, but as always, your staff are available. If you have any follow-up questions, I will post the recording and the slides to the South Atlantic website. Thank you all so much for tuning in today.